Thank you, Jeffrey, for coming to talk about the book you've edited with Nicholas de Warren. It's a collection of essays written in honor of Richard Cobb-Stevens, Professor Emeritus of Boston College's Philosophy Department. Often a book of this sort is called a festschrift. Before we get into the contents of the book, could you explain briefly what a festschrift is?
A festschrift is a celebratory text or collection of texts. I mean, the word itself says it. There's something festive about it. It's usually a gathering of writings meant to honor or celebrate the career of a scholar who has had a lasting impact or thought to be admirable or imitable in some particular way. There are various kinds of festschrifts or celebratory bundles of this sort. Some can be rather diverse. In French, they're sometimes called a mélange, just a kind of selection of texts brought together without necessarily a defining topic. And so it's really a matter of offering texts to the scholar who may be retiring or passing some kind of milestone. This particular festschrift is somewhat more concentrated, and so it belongs to a particular type. If you look into the festschrift gathered for Richard Cobb-Stevens, all of them pick up on themes or dimensions of his own work, or at least themes or dimensions very close to his own work, which is to say work on the philosophy of Husserl in particular, but as in dialogue or contact with all sorts of other things, texts and ideas and trends. When Richard Cobb-Stevens announced his retirement, there was, of course, some discussion about his succession and so forth. At a certain point, I was just getting together socially with a friend of mine who happens to be a Husserl scholar, and I said to him, well, you know that Richard is retiring pretty soon. And before I could go a step further, Nicholas, who is my co-editor in this volume, asked me who's arranging the festschrift. And I have to admit I hadn't thought about it until that moment, but agreed very quickly something ought to be done. So it grew from there. We drew up a list then and there of people we would like to invite to contribute. That was kind of a dream list, but very interestingly, and this says something about Richard Cobb-Stevens' work and his person, every single one of the people we invited immediately agreed, some within the same day. And so we have the text that we have.
What gave you the idea of a festschrift for Richard Cobb-Stevens?
Yeah, I guess I could say a little bit more about that. Richard's scholarship has been genuinely important. To some degree, I think it's still ahead of us. It works, as I've been saying, on the phenomenology of Husserl, but in contact with Anglo-American philosophy. And in the last few decades, that has become a growing trend of some importance for philosophical, but I would say also institutional reasons. There is a need to fertilize one another from either side of at least the perceived gap between Anglo-American philosophy and, let's just say, continental European thought, generally speaking. So that's a big part of it. I think had we contacted people who didn't know Richard at all, and maybe there are one or two in the volume, I'm not sure, they would have probably responded positively simply on the basis of respect for his work. But the fact is, Richard is just a beloved human being. The response we got from a number of people was, I would be especially happy to contribute to something for Richard Cobb-Stevens. And that, I must say, is a widespread feeling in our department as well as around the university. In my introduction, my short introduction to the volume, I point out that Richard is a great storyteller, a human being who mixes his humanity in and out of his philosophical work, and a tremendous citizen in the academy, both at Boston College and beyond.
What is phenomenology?
Phenomenology, I think, is best understood in the most general sense as a way of rigorous reflection on the contents of consciousness, or if we want to be very broad and loose about it, experience. Husserl, the founder, pretty much the founder of the school of thought or of the approach, tried to develop a method for getting at what actually occurs in any number of kinds of experience. We have to be careful not to speak too generally about phenomenology because already with the appearance of the works of his own students, it becomes rather diverse in approach and in method, as well as moving into all sorts of regions or ranges of investigation. Husserl himself was rather oriented to concerns with the status of the sciences in the usual sense of that word, and their place in what he perceived to be the heart or the root of modern rationality. And so a lot of Husserl's early work in particular is gathered around reflections on or explorations of consciousness as pertaining to cognition. His earliest work is in the philosophy of arithmetic, and that kind of tendency, I think it's fair to say, is orienting even for his work on into the later period of his life. So we're talking about 1900 through the early 1930s, let's say. Husserl's most prominent students included people like Edith Stein and Martin Heidegger, and what Heidegger or Stein develop is it begins to move somewhat away from the sorts of things Husserl was doing.
The essays do not restrict themselves to Husserl, and not even to phenomenology.
No, that's true. And there are a couple of reasons for that, it seems to me. I guess I've alluded to some of it already by now. Phenomenology itself, even in Husserl's own work, moves out and away from the pure exploration of the structures and contents of consciousness and the articulation of meaning, develops a philosophy of language and so forth, closely related to all of that. But it's also, at least implicitly, a philosophical anthropology. It has things to say about affectivity, about emotion and drive and desire and so forth. Some of those things turn up in various contributions to the Festschrift. And I'm thinking, for example, of Dan Zahavi's essay, which probes what Husserlian phenomenology might have to offer us in the attempt to think about quite what constitutes the living ego. Subsequent generations of phenomenologists have built from there in all different directions. Richard would be among them. For example, in Richard's case, moving on into some things Husserlian phenomenology has in common with the philosophy of William James. This is the topic of his doctoral dissertation and his earliest work. Others, like Robert Sokolowski, as we see in the essay here, has been able to develop political implications or insights for political thought, moving from connections and disconnections between Husserl's thinking and some aspects of modern political philosophy. In the case of Sokolowski's essay, specifically Hobbes. We could go on from there. So my first point about all of this is that Husserl himself sets the model for this kind of range in bringing phenomenology into dialogue with all sorts of other things. But, Richard himself, as anyone who knows him will quickly attest, has a very capacious mind. He certainly did not limit his career to the study of Husserl and thinkers that are easily connected to Husserlian phenomenology. He read Machiavelli with great interest, for example, and I think great depth. It was always extremely interesting to talk with him. It still is. About all sorts of things. He's always got a thought, and it's a well-worked-out thought. So that, too, I think, is respected in this Festschrift.
Would you like to add anything else?
I would say this about the Festschrift itself. It is a collection of high-level work. I'm rather happy about that because I'm not always sure that Richard's colleagues around BC understood that the kind of work he was doing was not only bridge building, but also extremely deep and sophisticated. But that does mean it's not for everyone. Many of the leading Husserl scholars in the world are represented in this volume, which I think probably means it is best put in the hands first of one another.